Okay, so this is a diagram that I found on Reddit. Now, it's very simple and straightforward, and it explains basically the same interpretation that I have, an interpretation I think is correct, but I don't think it gives you a full idea of the actual science behind parallel universes as we understand them. So I'm going to try to do a diagram that gives you some sense. It's a little more temporal. It kind of shows you how things develop over time rather than just looking at the static image, but it's a lot more confusing and convoluted and really hard to follow. So at the bottom here, we have time. Now, this is the only thing that is constant across every single reality. Now, the first time point we have is 14.6 billion years ago. Now, this is the time when the universe, as we know it, was first created. Now, immediately after the universe was created, every time that a subatomic particle in it could go in either one place or another place, both of those things actually took place. Both possibilities occurred, but within different realities. So immediately after the universe was created, it started splitting off into 2 realities, and then 4 realities, and then more and more and more. Every time that 2 things could occur, they both did, and that forced the creation of another universe. And understand that when people say parallel universes, alternate realities, parallel dimensions, another dimension, they're using those all interchangeably. Now, some of those terms are more accurate than others, but they're all acceptable terms. Now, the universe splits, it splits, it splits, it splits countless times, and so many universes are created, and eventually a timeline occurs where Earth comes into being for the first time within one timeline. And this will be our second point on our timeline at the bottom here, about 4 billion years ago. That's when Earth was created. So now from this single timeline, this single branch where Earth has been created for the first time, we continue to split. So we continue to do the same splitting, and now we have a bunch of different realities, all with Earth in them, just slightly different. And understand that initially the Earth here and the Earth here are almost identical except for the position of one subatomic particle. So these realities are almost identical, but as things continue to change and as we create more and more different realities and more particles go in different spots and more splits, eventually this Earth could be very different from this Earth here on this timeline. And eventually on one of the timelines where there's an Earth, because the biology of the organisms that get developed is so different, on one of these timelines we have humans, and humans occur for the first time on this timeline. On a different Earth timeline, we have clovers, and clovers appear for the first time on this timeline. So now we have a timeline where humans exist on Earth, and again, from this timeline we continue to get splitting. So now we have a bunch of different realities where human beings exist, and this is where we start to get our realities from the Clover trilogy. So the first timeline we're going to talk about is the reality from the original Cloverfield movie. We're going to call it Reality 1. So on this reality, eventually we get to a point, I'm going to put 2008 here, and then I'm going to put 008 here. So this is 2,000 years in the past. So at some point in the future, on another one of these timelines, they use a particle accelerator and it rips holes in space-time. So across these holes, things can fall through. Now, what happens is things just switch from one timeline to another. They don't actually switch positions. They can move around in time and they can jump in between different dimensions, but they don't actually change position. So what happens at this point, 008, is one of these monsters, these baby clovers on this version of Earth that is just hibernating below Earth's ocean. It just hops onto this timeline and it's in the exact same position, hibernating below Earth's oceans, and no one knows about it. So we get a baby clover monster that hops from this timeline to this timeline, hibernates for 2,000 years, and is then woken up by that company Tagruato. So Tagruato, under the cover of investigating the satellite that crashed in the ocean, that they say is their satellite, and that was seen in the end of the original Cloverfield movie, they use that as a cover because they want to do deep sea drilling, because they want to get this algae so they can make this drink called slush. Now, that's getting into the weeds. Now, some of that's debatable, but regardless, the company does deep sea drilling and wakes up this baby clover that has been lying dormant all these years. And then at 2008, on this timeline, we see the events of the Cloverfield 1 movie, and we see this Clover from this dimension ravaging through New York. Now we get our second timeline from the 10 Cloverfield Lane movie. Now we know that this split off from the first timeline relatively recently because things are so similar. So we get a recent split off, and then we'll call this timeline 2. And we know in 2016, aliens attack this timeline. Now, we don't know whether it has anything to do with the rips in space-time, but most likely on either this same timeline where the Cloverfield monsters are, or a slightly different timeline where it's slightly different monsters. These monsters from the space-time rip that occurs way in the future on a different timeline comes into this second timeline from 10 Cloverfield Lane. Now we get our third and fourth timelines that we see, and we see this in the latest Cloverfield movie. Now, these timelines, I think they split off earlier because 20 years between 2008 and 2028, when Cloverfield Paradox is, that's not a lot of time for the world to be so radically different. And we see the energy drought and a world that is very different, but in some ways is the same. We see similar technology, so I would say the split occurred a little bit before, and we see a split occur, and now we're on this timeline. And this timeline, a bunch of other timelines split off, but eventually we get to a timeline where there's a big energy crisis and they're trying to solve it using this shepherd. And at this point, we have a very recent split, and this is the split that gives us the two timelines that we see in Cloverfield Paradox. We can call them 3 and 4. Now in timeline 3, that is the paradox. That is the timeline the movie starts with, and we see in this timeline Ava installs a power cell. Actually, so Ava installs a power cell somewhere here before the split of the timelines. And then split. And in one of these splits, the power cell explodes and kills her family. In the other split, it doesn't. And in this timeline, the timeline that we start with in Cloverfield Paradox, they managed to successfully use the shepherd and the particle accelerator to create this infinite energy, and also creates a bunch of rips in space-time, all the ones we've talked about. So one rip occurs here, where from a monster Earth, we get it going to the first original timeline and hibernating. It also creates another rip, let's say maybe from this monster Earth, and it causes the aliens that we see in 10 Cloverfield Lane. It also causes a rip from, let's say, this monster world, and it comes and it dumps that horrible monster we see at the end of the Cloverfield Paradox. Now it also causes a rip between these two realities, and we see the space shuttle fall from reality 3 into reality 4. So understand, at a given point in time, let's say 2008, there are countless realities that are existing at that time. Now some of the realities, like these two, they're very similar because they split off right around that time that we're looking at, but other realities, like let's say this reality and that reality, they're very different because the original time that they split off way back here. So these realities are going to be so different, and one of them could have these horrifying demon monsters in it, the other could have us or people very similar to us in it. And one more thing, if you do time travel on the same timeline, that creates a bunch of paradoxes related to time travel. However, if you do time travel and then also jump timelines and switch dimensions or switch realities, that actually doesn't cause the same paradoxes. And then also on this reality too, the 10 Cloverfield Lane reality, we have someone with the last name of Stambler. Now he is John Goodman, who traps the woman in his bunker. On this reality, the reality number 3 of Cloverfield Paradox, the guy who's a conspiracy guy who wrote the book that's saying, look, don't set off this particle accelerator, it's going to cause all these problems. His last name is Stambler also, and the actor who plays the guy, he's a different actor, but they look somewhat similar. Now, a lot of different interpretations for this. One is that it's the same guy fundamentally, it's just on different realities with a different first name, so they have the same fundamental drives, but one of them, they fulfill their drives by writing a book, the other fulfills their drives by building this bunker. Now, or you could say they're relatives, but in different realities. So there's a conspiracy book guy and a bunker builder on this reality, the second reality, and their relatives. And then there's also a conspiracy book guy and a bunker builder on this third reality as well, and they're related in that reality as well. And in this third reality that Cloverfield Paradox opened with, there's no war broken out yet because there's still hope for the Shepherd. In the fourth reality, since the Shepherd crashed because of the sabotage, now war has broken out, presumably because now there's no hope left. And by the way, we know that Howard Stambler, who's the guy who kept the woman in the bunker in 10 Cloverfield Lane, we know that he was an employee of Tagruato, that company that awoke in the monster in the first original Cloverfield. It's unclear whether Mark Stambler, who's the book writer that's on the news that I talked about in this third reality, it's unclear whether he has any affiliation with Tagruato, was ever an employee. And last thing I'll mention, Cloverfield 4, which has already been filmed, it's set during World War II, and also there's supernatural forces in that as well. So it's possible that there was another split after World War II started, so a little earlier than these splits, but still pretty recent, and this is going to be the fifth reality of Cloverfield 4. And again, this event here that created all these rips, one rip gets created, maybe a whole nother possible Earth with completely other kind of creatures, and a rip gets created here, and that's where we get both World War II and the weird creatures. And last thing I'll say, my diagram does not remotely do justice to how many realities there are. Every second, there's countless splits and countless realities that get created. So if you go by probability, the probability that a movie we see, or a reality we see in one Cloverfield movie and a reality we see in another are the same is actually very small.